Okay, no intro this time. I think I fixed it. I think uh, it was a problem with my laptop's hardware. I think the CPU overheated, and I seriously dropped down the quality because I don't think it's that important for these. And I hope this will work now without any interruptions. Um, so no intro to those who are watching this later. My the last two streams they kind of cut off, and just died more or less, and I think it was because of my laptop's hardware. So let's get right into it. Okay, 30 Years War will be the period we'll be covering in this one. Again, we are using mainly Christopher Clark's book Preußen, Aufstieg und Niedergang as our main thread to get along Prussia's history. And this time we will be covering the 30 Years War. Okay, first some things on the 30 Years War, which takes place from 1618 to 1648. Of course, last time we stopped in 1618, and now we'll be covering the next 30 years. This is the most destructive war Europe has seen so far. So it will give us 1.5 million dead soldiers, 6.5 million dead civilians. In some parts of Germany, 60% of the population will die. And there's, I think, a lot to be said about this war, especially also just seeing how much or how high of a toll it had on the civilian population. It is so gruesome that it spawns its own genre of disaster stories. So there will be pamphlets, leaflets, little books making the rounds through Europe at the time, where people are outlining the exploits and horrific torturing methods that are going on. And it will also be the cause for secular laws of war. Up until this point, there have only been church laws for war, which of course only have been part of the church and enforced by the church. But now we also have secular laws of war that will lead into things we know from nowadays, where you have like war crimes and the Geneva Convention. And all of those are, of course, also a reaction to incredibly tough and harsh situations during wars. And this is the first time we see this. In many ways, this really is the first modern war. Very different from medieval wars. Medieval wars were usually you and the guys. To me, the king and his knights are always you and the guys. Wanting to piss off another king, or not really piss off, but to harm them in some way. So what you would usually do is you would kind of like ride over to him, and you would torch his lands, so his fields and like the houses, his villages and everything. Usually the people would flee before you arrive, and then he would either come out of his castle to meet you and to kind of deflect your attack, or you would just harm him in that way and then retreat. Sometimes, of course, there would be a siege, but that wouldn't actually be, let's say, that common. Most of the wars of the exploits were just kind of a raid from one country on another, and most of these wars were settled in one big battle, and the decisive battle, and then everybody would more or less go home. Why is this war so gruesome? There's many ideas on it. One of the main things, of course, is that there are way more people in Europe now. So it's just the armies are way bigger. They are more professional in a sense. They're still mostly untrained, and there's still, let's say, very lax standards. But there's more ideas of moving around. So there isn't really the decisive battle anymore. There's battle maneuvers now. There's sieges, there's strategic decisions, but all of this also leads into a prolonged war and the kind of scenario we will see and that we will outline. It is possibly the most important event in the history of European Christianity. With this war, it will stop any ability for the church to reunite. It kind of puts in a ceasefire between Protestants and Catholics, and the Catholics will never be able to make Protestants back into get them back into the Catholic Church. And as you will also see, it kind of like starts certain things, certain trends in Europe. And that will also go on throughout European history, and that we will be catching up with as all of this goes on. But kind of going back to the 30 Years' War, most of its gruesomeness, what I always want to do on this channel is because I think a lot of people are very miseducated by things like Game of Thrones, because you watch Game of Thrones and then you say, okay, of course the dragons are RBS and the ice zombies are BS. And first of all, you shouldn't watch Game of Thrones, obviously. But second of all, like with that and any other, let's say, modern show about the past, they usually sneak in the kind of hatred for humanity that we have these days. And so it's very commonly assumed that everybody is secretly some, raging evil person that is only held in check by societal conventions. And so when you have these things like exploits during wars, like raping, pillaging, those kind of things, then in the modern world, that is always kind of seen as the release the people get. They go into the city, then they all start running somewhere, nobody knows where. And then there's like women and children and elderly people running away, screaming, ah! And that is how those things happen. And there's, let's say, some sense of that. There's when they took a city, they would of course start, let's say, going into the city and taking whatever they wanted. Not that wasn't, let's say, as common in the medieval world, although it also did happen, of course, especially looting. But in the 30 Years' War, in the later parts of it, because the 30 Years' War is basically also a war of attrition. It is very modern in that sense, where it's just like going on and on. I mean, it's 30 years of war, right? And so after a while, everybody will be kind of like bankrupt. So the generals will allow their armies to pillage to kind of make up for the lost wages. And of course, with pillaging, there also come the territories of rape, of abuse, of torture, and so on and so forth. It's kind of like once you open yourself up to sin, just starts pouring in. Which doesn't mean that it didn't happen before as well, but it was usually penalized, and then one thing led to another, and so on and so forth, and it just became more and more horrible, more and more gruesome. The other thing we have to remember is that this is a time where kind of military warfare really has to reinvent itself, but it hasn't done so yet. And so the danger a city has is about as big for an allied army as it is for an opposing army. So in the history of Brandenburg, we will, for example, see some allied armies are kind of walking by Brandenburg and occupying Brandenburg, and or cities in Brandenburg, to kind of rest, and they will demand rations, and they will demand they will demand shelter. And what usually happens is that the soldiers will sleep in the citizens' houses, which can sometimes lead to situations where soldier goes, they're usually quartered in the living room, if there even are multiple rooms. Then in the night, the soldier goes up and does whatever. And they can also lead to situations where where the soldiers are demanding more rations, and then they either get them, so the village has to give up more than they can take, or they start beating down villagers at the site when nobody's looking to get more food. I was discussing the whole scenario with a friend because it's just that gruesome. If you read into it, also the ways that they just tortured people for fun, it's that gruesome. And it kind of like develops worse and worse and worse, and we kind of think, okay, like what could you do to kind of not be in that situation? Like what could have been done better at the time? And the only thing we could have come up with was that the generals should have realized at a certain point, okay, we don't have any food, and there's also just no food going around because this area has been under constant war for multiple years now, and we don't have enough money to pay the wages. so I will retreat these troops no matter what the king or the emperor orders me to do. But almost nobody was willing to do that. Of course, for one reason, it's kind of their career. Like if you do that, then you will never be a general again, basically. And the other one is many people, even though it was like in contemporary scholarship, it's usually seen as more of a war of factions and a political war than a religious war. And that is definitely applicable, I would say. If you look at it, like where people fight, like there's a lot of Protestants fighting on the quote-unquote Catholic side, a lot of Catholics fighting on the quote-unquote Protestant side. And what predicts, let's say, the allegiance much more is which part of the side between the House of Habsburg and the House of Bourbon do the people fall under. And those Bourbonites then, of course, fight on the quote-unquote Protestant side, and the Habsburgers fight on the quote-unquote Catholic side. And but still, kind of going back to, it is a oh no, I've lost my thread. Okay, let's just move on. It is possibly the most important event in the history of European Christianity. I think I just mentioned that, or maybe I just mentioned it in the 2 streams before, so we'll shortly repeat it. This will stop the European heart from beating as one. This will stop any kind of ideas of reunification of the church, because the peace that it entails gives everybody kind of securities that they can keep their faith, and there will be no budging against that. And it kind of draws these lines in Europe. I, of course, always like to go on about the somebody says in chat, audio is feel better. Okay, thank you, John. I think there was some problems with my hardware. I think I fixed them now. I think we can make it through the stream now. So going on the ideas. So I like to blame the Enlightenment for kind of ruining Europe, and let's say the soil that the Enlightenment feeds on. This is really the area. This is what divides Europe forever and puts Europe into a state where there will only be war. Not quite true, but it does kind of like the idea of a Europe before that was Christendom, right? And the idea of Christendom kind of shatters in the 30 Years' War. So there are 2 people that are important in our story here. And those are the 2 Dukes of War, quote unquote. There's one Georg Wilhelm, who kind of takes all the bad things, and there's one Friedrich Wilhelm, who kind of takes all the good things. And history kind of treats them accordingly. So Georg Wilhelm is remembered as the incompetent leader, and actually Frederick the Great, we will get to Frederick, but Frederick will write about him that if there had been another duke like Georg, then Brandenburg wouldn't have survived. And I think he does that in part also just to kind of prop up Friedrich Wilhelm, who will become like a almost legend amongst the Hohenzollerns. But it is still the case that Georg Wilhelm usually gets mistreated by history, because under him Brandenburg is just the absolute whipping boy of Europe. But he doesn't have it easy. I talked about the kind of situation that Brandenburg is in 1618. And if you guys remember, they have no allies. They have the incredibly powerful estates that basically don't want to do anything. Actually, during this war, the estates will kind of be plundered and Brandenburg will be under attack. And the estates still will refuse to cooperate with the Duke. So they're kind of problematic, but we will get to that because they will see some changes happen with the war. He is also a Calvinist that reigns over powerful, and as I just said, uncooperative Lutheran estates and Protestant infighting. Some people think it starts later, it starts from the very beginning. And so to a Calvinist, a Lutheran is almost as bad as a Catholic, even though all Protestants, especially at this time, kind of have a burning hatred for Catholicism. And his interior politics will fall to a guy called Schwarzenberg. And Schwarzenberg is a really interesting character. So Schwarzenberg is the only Catholic in the court. And in the beginning, he's kind of the leader of a faction in the court that is pro-Habsburg. There's another faction that is pro-Protestant or pro-Sweden. Something that also should be mentioned here, the book mentions it in specifically, is that women were very important in politics at the time. I think we often have these, let's say, propagandized views of history where women don't have any rights and everybody hates them, no girls allowed. But actually, they were very important, especially in foreign diplomacy, because it was very usual that if there were these kind of alliances going on, that you would get access to an alliance through the connections of the women at court, who would have friends in other courts, and they would kind of set up the beginning of getting you into certain circles and onto the right tables, and then you could kind of see what kind of alliance you wanted to join. But in this scenario, also the women at court were split. Some supported the Protestant cause, some supported the Catholic cause or the emperor's cause. So there was it was a very hung-up court in a sense. And Schwarzenberg kind of does himself apart. He is really the outsider figure, again, the only Catholic at court. And he starts taking it over more and more. And he more or less strips the estates of their rights. He takes over the military. He kind of reforms the military into having some sense of apparatus. No sense of military apparatus in Brandenburg at the time. Schwarzenberg is the first one who kind of does it. He collects all the armies and he starts fighting a guerrilla war against the Swedish. And we will get to who they're fighting against and when in a second. But yeah, Schwarzenberg, the book describes him as the first idea in absolutism. He kind of takes over as an unelected dictator. This will not be the only time this happens in Brandenburg. Actually, more or less exactly the same scenario will happen again in the Napoleonic Wars, but that's spoilers. He will also, most importantly, he will tax the high heavens out of the estates. He will kind of start stripping them of their, let's say, real position, using something that is akin to a martial law, and he will just tax them to the degree to which they should have been taxed from the beginning for Brandenburg to more or less survive. But he only comes into the picture in the later parts of the entire thing. So the war will be taken over later by Friedrich Wilhelm. Again, his nickname will be the Great Elector, and I think the only reason it's the Great Elector is because the Great is reserved to Frederick. He is the longest reigning Hohenzollern in history, 48 years of reign. He is, in his youth, heavily influenced by Dutch culture and politics and kind of Dutchifies Prussia. And his ideas of hard work and responsibility become iconic for his descendants. So, for example, if you look at Frederick, the famed potato king, this Friedrich Wilhelm will be the icon of King Frederick. Friedrich Wilhelm is the first person who sees himself not as a guy who just owns a bunch of land, as I said before, right? Like up to this point, the Hohenzollerns are more or less a family that kind of makes its way through life. And he is the first person who sees himself as a sovereign who is responsible for the well-being of his citizens and takes that position seriously. So he will be almost turned into an workaholic, working day and night, which was very unusual for a sovereign at the time. It was very usual for a sovereign at the time to just kind of like delight in his possessions and make some politics at the side. But Friedrich Wilhelm will become absorbed into politics and into running his country and kind of give this new idea of rulership. I think we will not be going on to more on that because there will be also political reforms coming, but we'll cover that in a second. Okay, so let's look at the war. So this map is a bit straining if you look at it for the first time. Basically, has the wars between 1618 to 1630 on here, and the wars from 1630 to 1635, and there's also some aftermath here, but it's not important right now. The only reason I put this here is because it shows more or less all the major movements of war, shows how the war was really all over the German area, and more importantly, it kind of shows how the war's all over Brandenburg. Of course, we know here's some Brandenburg, right? Here's some Brandenburg, and down here's some Brandenburg. So wherever there's war, there's also Brandenburg. And this is going back, of course, into the position that Georg Wilhelm inherits. And that is, in the beginning, he tries to be loyal to so what he actually tries to do, but what he can't do, is he tries to be neutral. But of course, he's between the fronts, right? The Swedish are here, and they're the biggest, let's say, especially in the northern front and in the heartlands of Brandenburg. They're the biggest faction. And the emperor's here, and of course, they always meet in the area of Brandenburg. And at first, the kind of the imperial troops are moving up, and he begrudgingly helps the empire. And again, you have to remember that at this time, having even an allied army stationed in your cities would cause starvation amongst the population and looting and what have you. And then later the Swedish would be coming down, and the Swedish king more or less made him an offer he couldn't refuse. Either he would more or less marry into the Swedish army and get parts of Pomerania and be happy ever after, or the Swedish would just, they had stationed their cannons around the town and aimed them at the city gates. So the Swedish king more or less said, if you don't say yes, then I will just give them the order to shoot. And again, Brandenburg didn't have anything of an army at this point, 3,000 troops, I think, and I think this is even before Schwarzenberg kind of collects the troops, so there's nothing he does about this. And so he cooperates with the Swedish for a time, and then of course Gustavus Adolphus, who's the Swedish king, kind of goes down here. You see him kind of walking around, and then Gustavus Adolphus dies in the war. That kind of turns the tides against the Swedish, who have been more or less winning at the time, and they're driven back again. The Swedish will kind of scar the Germans for centuries to come. They will actually be villages in Brandenburg. They completely lose their history, and there's, let's say, quotes from the time where they go, "We do not have any history from before the Swedish came." Whatever. And there's also certain landmarks that will be named or will get new names, like the Swedish fortress, because the name of the fortress is forgotten. And so I think the Swedish wall or something, because the name of the wall is forgotten, and the last thing that people remember about it is that the Swedish occupied it once, or that the Swedish used it once. So it becomes the Swedish wall. And so, yeah, again, he's just Georg is just in a position where it's easy to give him flak historically. Oh no. Is the stream still going on? I think it is. I think it's just on my trying to kind of surveil this with my phone, but I think it's still going on. Okay. So, as I said, the situation is dire, but he can't really do anything about it. He has to be the whipping boy in Europe. There's not much that he can do here. But under Friedrich Wilhelm, everything changes. In the beginning, the book actually just didn't have anything about what he did more or less from 1640 to 1648. what we know is that, again, Schwarzenberg kind of collected the armies and started a more or less guerrilla war when the peace treaty is made. And the French are looking for a satellite state in Europe, and Brandenburg is totally willing to be that satellite state because it gives them Eastern Pomerania, and also these cities here and Minden too. And this is, of course, the big thing, right? So Brandenburg, again, they have to connect these lands. Eastern Pomerania is a huge step in the right connection. They are now really connected to Prussia. And this is where Brandenburg really becomes Brandenburg-Prussia. And Friedrich Wilhelm is also a kind of king who says that sea trade and the navy are the backbone of a state, which is a very good idea and is something that even people, let's say, who think about or work in geostrategy to this day believe in. And so he will make a lot of use of Eastern Pomerania, but we will come to that in the next video, where we kind of like cover the aftermath of his reign and the development of Brandenburg as the military Prussia that we really know it as today. Friedrich Wilhelm, of course, also realizes in the aftermath of the war that they need an army. They have to be able to defend themselves coming out of the war, even though they basically just only took a beating. They will be the second largest territory in Germany. The largest, of course, being the holdings of the emperor. And they will be surrounded by, well, more or less the emperor, and who they kind of have to swear allegiance to, and Poland, who they also kind of have to swear allegiance to. And they will have to be able to protect themselves against those. So this is kind of what happens, let's say, on a military side and on the political side. But something else that's also very important that happens is kind of that Brandenburg will start understanding itself very differently. And here, again, our man Schwarzenberg becomes very important. And also another man who is incredibly important to the history of Prussia and more or less makes Prussia into what it is in many senses, but is completely omitted from all the history books. And that is a man called Pufendorf. Pufendorf is an intellectual, I don't know from what university, but just an intellectual at the time. And Pufendorf learns from Thomas Hobbes. And of course, Thomas Hobbes, kind of his entire take on politics comes out of the 30 Years' War. Because what in the 30 Years' War we really see is anarchy. Because the entire, let's say, system in Germany and in Europe and Central Europe breaks down. And it gives way to a sense of anarchy. And this is really what Hobbes writes about in the Leviathan and the need for the state to kind of protect people from this anarchy. And Pufendorf will pick this up. And he will extend it with a few ideas. And one of the ideas that is very important that Pufendorf also picks up is that he believes that the state needs to change with the times. And that is, of course, something that Germany still believes in to this day, and something that goes on and on and on to this day. And the other thing that he kind of brings into the understanding of the Hohenzollerns is the idea of sovereignty as something that is just a necessity of the situation. Something that just comes out of almost natural law. And I've mentioned this in the last video, and I kind of want to pick this up here again, where in the last video I mentioned how we had gone from the feudal system to the estate system, and we're shifting more and more and more away from the idea of divinely based government and more into the ideas of socially based government and so on and so forth. And this is really another important shift into that direction, where Pufendorf has these ideas of the sovereign basically being in this position because nature demands it, because just, let's say, the chaos that otherwise would be there demands it, but not because of any kind of divine mandate. And together with the ideas from Friedrich Wilhelm about being he doesn't really say a servant to his people, like Frederick does, but being just the man who's responsible for the community at large, will get more and more and shift more and more into these ideas of social governance. And what we will have in Germany later and later and later. And of course, then you only need to re-examine the ideas of like these ideas of, okay, do we really fall into anarchy once we kind of weaken the state, and do we really need the central authority of the king? And that is kind of what happens from 1945, where the American mythos kind of breaks into Germany, and that is how Germany gets so, let's say, democracy obsessed so quickly, because they had already been at a point of social governance instead of divine governance. But yeah, I think that is all. Again, we kind of see in the 30 Years' War, Brandenburg is taken to the crucible. Everything is burned to the ground. Brandenburg is one of the places where some villages lose 60% of their population. But it comes out of it with very new ideas from Friedrich Wilhelm, a lot of them imported from the Netherlands. And of course, an understanding that an army is necessary. They get the first ideas of progressivism, in a sense, from Pufendorf, where the state has to go with the times. And we will see how all of this plays out in the future, how Brandenburg will rise and rise and rise, and then in the end, of course, fall with the German Empire. Yeah, I hope you guys enjoyed it. I think there's nothing else in chat, so yeah, I'm sorry for all the problems I had with the stream today. I'm still learning this, and I hope I will be getting better going forward. Bye bye.